Hi, hello everyone, and welcome to the first session of day 2 of the Brendan Hoy Open Talk 2022 Forum. I'm Michele Zanini, and I know it's a bit late where you are. If you're in Asia, a bit early. If you're joining us from the Americas, but I'm really glad that you made the choice to be with us, and we'll definitely do our very best to make sure that you come away from this session thinking it was well worth your while. And the topics that is really guiding the session is certainly a big one, going beyond either or getting organizations to, in a way, transcend trade-offs that seem to be irreconcilable, such as efficiency and entrepreneurship, or as they say in the United States, where I'm calling you from, is getting organizations to walk and kind of chew gum at the same time. Now, we have an amazing trio of panelists who will bring very provocative, yet very practical perspectives on this challenge, and I will introduce them very shortly. But if you'll indulge me, I'd like to provide a few thoughts just to frame the conversation. So let's see if I can share my screen here to kind of help along. So basically, let me just start with a question. What are some of the more pressing priorities in your organization that are kind of competing with one another, are kind of in conflict, in tension? Perhaps it is scale versus flexibility, or perhaps it's creativity versus discipline, or speed versus diligence, or risk-taking versus being prudent, right? And these are all trade-offs that reflect kind of a deeper paradox, the tension between exploit and explore. And this is a phrase that, or a term that came to the fore thanks to James March, who is an organizational theory. He won the Nobel Prize, right? And he basically argued that the basic problem for any organization was to do both, right? To kind of make sure that it was doing enough in the short term to remain viable, but at the same time, find opportunities in the future that would make it viable not only in the short term, but in the longer term. And it seems to me that few organizations really get this right. If you look at incumbents, large established organizations, they seldom invent the future. As a rule, they're not the ones that create new businesses or redefine customer expectations. They're not the first ones to exploit new technologies or harness emerging trends. Instead, they kind of turn the crank, right? They reap efficiencies by doing the same thing over and over again. And in most organizations, what should be an evenly matched kind of contest, right, between exploit and explore is kind of a one-sided thrashing. I mean, consider your own organization. Where does it come down on these kinds of trade-offs? What gets the attention of top management? What is really considered crucial and what is really considered optional? And at least in my experience, the trade-offs are systematically the ones on the right, the choices on the right are favored versus the ones on the left. And it's not that people are oblivious to these trade-offs, but they just kind of skew towards one. Now, several years ago, the penalties for not managing these trade-offs was might have been tolerable, but no longer. We live in a world where you need to be incredibly efficient and highly innovative at the same time. Hire is a pretty good example of a company that is able to do both. And and that's the kind of organization that we argue would be the one that will thrive in the future. That you're able to make these subtle trade-offs, right, between explore and exploit, or better yet, redefine the frontier. Get more of both at the same time. Now, the question is, how can you achieve this in practice? How do you avoid artless kind of top-down trade-offs? How do you really escape the curse of like this either-or thinking? And I'm truly honest to have an amazing set of panelists to help us answer these really difficult questions. So I will introduce two of them now, and hopefully the third will join us shortly. So I'm going to start with Julia Haut. Julia is a professor of strategic management at the University of Innsbruck in Austria. She has long focused on new and more effective ways for organizations to approach innovation, collaboration, and setting direction. And recently co-authored a wonderful book on this topic called Open Strategy. The second panelist that I'm going to introduce now is Tom van der Lubbe, a philosopher entrepreneur, right? Tom, I think that's how I've seen you being described, who more than a decade ago founded Vizi, a Dutch financial services company that offers mortgage solutions for highly educated customers. And the company Vizi has a unique model of organization that is based on self-management, and it reflects Tom's kind of iconoclastic, maverick views on the role of people in organizations and the role of organizations and business in society. So Julia and Tom, welcome, and thanks for taking the time to share your wisdom with me and the audience. And the way we will approach this is that each of you will get 10 or so minutes, perhaps more, take more if you need, to give some context on your experience and bring to life some of the most important management tensions you had to solve for in your organization or in companies that you interact with. And then we'll transition to a more fluid interactive session. I'll start off with a question for you just to get you going, but just as a reminder to our audience, please share the questions you'd like to see answered in the chat. We should have plenty of time to tackle them later in the session. So with that as set up, I think we can get going. And so Julia, let me start with you. You are a world-leading expert on strategy and innovation, and you've often put the modified open in front of these terms of open strategy, open innovation. But someone who isn't familiar with your work and is more kind of old school might think these terms kind of don't go together. What do you mean open strategy? Strategy is supposed to be secret, developed by a handful of people that have the right skills, the right perspective, because they're at the top, they can see everything, and they have insider information, only they can make those calls. So what would you say to people who kind of would push back on this whole idea of being open when it comes to strategy or innovation?
Yeah, thank you, Michele. First of all, thank you for having me on this panel. It's great to be here. And I'd like to take the chance to talk today a little bit about what you have just mentioned, the dilemmas that might be related to openness in terms of being in control or giving up your control. And therefore, let me just start out a little bit with what is strategy about and what are traditional approaches to strategy. So strategy is really about having, is about three questions. Where are we as organizations at the moment? Where do we want to go in the future? And how do we get there? And typically, as you have mentioned, those questions are answered by small groups of top management teams behind doors of closed boardrooms. And then those management teams come out and they tell it to the middle managers, and they are then responsible to communicate it to the employees. And what I'd argue is that such a traditional approach, a closed approach to strategy making, it's just no longer working today. And let me give some reasons why this is the case, but let me just very briefly define open strategy. So what is openness? With openness, we really mean involving a wider set of people outside the top management team in strategy deliberations. Now that could be, I don't know, employees, frontline employees, customers, startups, experts, even competitors who somehow give an input in your strategy process. And over the last years, we have studied many organizations that have opened up their strategy process, and we have seen that there are multiple ways to do so. And we have tried to structure them somehow. So in our book, we see that there are ways to bring people together in an analog way. So have different workshop formats, integrate internals and externals in settings where they work together in small groups. But of course, digital technologies and social media just gives us enormous opportunities in bringing people together from all over the world. So we have seen organizations opening up their strategy process by using community platforms, setting up strategy jams, having social networks, prediction markets. So many different ways to do that. Now, how can those tools really help to improve the strategy process? And why is the strategy process in a traditional way no longer successful anymore? Now, what is the reason why organizations should open up the strategy process? If you think about the traditional process that I've just described at the very beginning, of course, those small top management teams where people have very similar backgrounds, similar experience, they might be very much limited in their ability to see new opportunities. They have built up their cognitive models about how the world works, about how their industry works. And of course, their experience is very important, but it hinders them from seeing what's going on there, what could be potential opportunities to connect to new fields. And on the other hand, if you think about employees who are just passive recipients from top-down information, it's of course very hard for them to feel emotional about a strategy, to feel connected to a strategy. And if you think about all those discussions that are currently going on about quiet quitting and people who feel disengaged in the workplace, that's of course a problem that can't be ignored. So we have asked more than 200 executives in US and European companies why they would open up the strategy process and what would be the reason. And we see those two big benefits. The most important one is really that it allows to increase understanding of strategy within organizations. It allows to increase commitment and thereby implementation. On the other hand, of course, you get much more ideas and inputs from diverse fields, and you have the opportunity to find potential ways and new business models, for example. However, if we talk with executives, they are quite convinced about those arguments, but they also feel quite reluctant and shy a little bit away of opening up. And of course, there are reasons why that is the case. We have seen that there are several dilemmas or trade-offs, like you said, are related to an open strategy process. Let me just very briefly go through some of them. If you open up the strategy process and have a lot of actors, a huge number of actors in them, of course, the process can become slower. Of course, you give up some kind of flexibility, at least in some stage of the process. If you enable people to voice their ideas and give suggestions, of course, you raise certain expectations about the impact of their contributions, about how they can be involved in later stages of the process. And of course, it means a lot of effort for them to engage in those initiatives, and they want to be recognized. But so there are several of those dilemmas that I've mentioned on the list, but I think the most important one that are mentioned by executives is really the fear of losing proprietary information, the fear of, by opening up, revealing competitive secrets and important information to competitors. So they perceive really there is a trade-off that you were talking about. There is either the opportunity to benefit from openness and get all those benefits that I've just talked about, or that they can keep their proprietary information safe. And we'll argue, and hopefully I can convince you also, that there is nothing about such trade-off. Rather, we say you can be open and you can still be secretive at the same time. Because when we were studying open strategy in different organizations, we found that the most secretive organizations in the world that are really defined by secrecy in their DNA were able to benefit from opening up. And I just want to share a very brief story about one of those cases. So if you are on the web, you might have seen all those photographs of bisons that are every year taken in the Yellowstone National Park by tourists. So one day on a crowdsourcing platform, a contest popped up and it asked the question, what if we could develop an algorithm that allows us to use the data, GPS data and everything in those photographs to track the movement and migration patterns of bison herds and animals in the Yellowstone National Park. Big advantage for scientists. It would allow them to follow them without going physically after the herds and follow them in many, many hours. So the contest took place, and I would love to tell you that it really contributed to nature conversation on the health of the bisons, but actually it didn't. It had nothing to do with bisons at all. Rather, it was set up by the US intelligence community to get input and to get a way in order to be able to track migrations and track hostile military vehicles in contested areas. So, of course, they couldn't post the question on the web, but by reframing it, by obfuscating their problem, they found a way to get the entire world thinking about their problem without revealing any sensitive information. And they got a solution very quickly, very cheap. I think the winner got $2,000. And as I've said, the entire crowd participated. So yes, you can open up, but you have to do it in a careful way. Opening up does not mean chaos. So that's important. It's not a trade-off between giving up control or not. You have to plan it. And therefore, you have to ask 3 questions, I think, to be able to handle this trade-off and turn this trade-off in being able to have it simultaneously. You have to ask, why do I open up? Who should then be involved? And how should I involve those people? And the questions relate to those 3 phases that we see in a strategy process. Do I want to just collect a bunch of ideas? Do I just want to see many, many opportunities? Or do I want to go a little bit deeper and develop a very specific business model already? Or do I want to stimulate and mobilize all the people within my organization? And of course, this requires different kind of people to be involved. Just to bringing this together before, and this shows me if I just want to collect ideas, I don't necessarily have to reveal a lot of information myself as an organization, as we have just seen in this example. So this allows me to use digital technologies and involve all those externals without revealing anything. If I go in the next phase, I might rather work then with smaller groups of people in an analog setting and set up a workshop, specifically select the people, even set up an NDA if I feel better then, and make sure that I do not lose any information here. And in the final phase, of course, it makes much more sense to open up internally within an organization to get all your employees involved. And in this later stage, it does not necessarily might be a problem if you reveal information to your competitors, because you are already ahead of them. So you are already later in the process. So we say, if you set this up in a careful way, and if you think about what's going on, there is no trade-off between openness and between revealing information, and you can have it both in a controlled way. Yes. So
thank you, Julia. Yeah, that was awesome.
Yeah,
go ahead. Sorry.
I hope we get a chance to discuss a little bit more about the dilemma and the trade-offs that are related to this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love that example of the bison. Very devious example, but very clever. And, that's just one of the many ways in which you can, as you say, you want to separate in all these trade-offs, the kind of the what from the how. Yeah, of course you want some secrecy where it matters. The question though is like, how do you get that? And so there's the traditional way, which is like keep everything under wraps, but that's just one of many ways. And if you actually start by saying, well, we want to make this open, how do we make this open and be secret? Then that will push you to think differently about the problem. So anyway, we'll get into more dialogue and discussion. And one of the questions that I want to anticipate for you is like, why aren't more companies doing this given all the benefits? But we'll come to that later. And I'm thrilled to welcome our third panelist, Marcus Norberg, who I think is on the line. Marcus, you there? I think you're on mute, Marcus. But
yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay, awesome. Yes, thank you. So maybe we'll come to you, and I'll just do the quick intro now, Marcus, since you're with us. So you are the head of resource development at CERN, and CERN is one of the largest and most respected centers of scientific research in the world. And you have a long career at CERN, and early in the career, you were the resource coordinator of the Atlas experiment, one of the 4 research initiatives that make up the Large Hadron Collider. And the Atlas experiment encompassed thousands of scientists, more than 3,000, from a variety of institutions, almost 200. And it was launched with this amazing goal of, uncovering the deepest secrets of the universe and expand our understanding of particle physics. And to that end, Marcus and the team at Atlas built one of the most sophisticated machines ever built, and did so by avoiding the kind of typical top-down management playbook. I mean, in a way, like if I think about extreme organizing as a challenge, you were like at the forefront of that. One of the things you've also done, Marcus, is write a wonderful book called Collisions and Collaborations, and I encourage everyone to check it out. It's very, very interesting. It talks about the whole process and the thinking of how do you manage this kind of activity in non-traditional kind of with non-traditional organizational methods. But one of the things, maybe to just tee us up, Marcus, is a quote from the introduction that you wrote, where you basically say that we are like operating at the frontier of knowledge, of human knowledge, right? And we were doing that with 3,000 scientists who were just not going to be very open to the idea of being told what to do and being managed, right? And so you're kind of, in a way, like in the US, herding cats, right? As they say. And so like the fundamental dilemma is, how do you do this? Like, how do you sustain creativity and productive interactions with all these people working on something that is new to the world and is highly complex, while at the same time, meeting the goals, keeping everybody happy, and meeting the goals you did, right? Because you delivered the detector, the particle detector, on time, on budget, right? So how do you do this? How do you answer this question you pose so well in the book?
Well, good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody, and my apologies for missing the first part. Had some technical difficulties. Even in places like CERN, sometimes we enter into glitches. So great, Michele, great question. I wish I would have a clear answer to it. We wrote the book in the hope that people might tell us the answer, the real answer. There are many. But to summarize this, what is important to understand is that we here at CERN and elsewhere in science, we do these projects which are really a bottom-up construction. So it starts basically with 5 or 6 or a limited number of people in the cafeteria, dreaming, really, literally dreaming about what we could do as a community, what discoveries we could make. And in our specific case, it's about understanding the beginning of the universe. So that's where it starts from. It starts from a small group of people who then create other groups and so on and so forth. And then a structure emerges. And that structure that emerges is in a sense, is organic and it's dynamic. It is really driven by the problems. It's driven by the purpose. That means to say that everybody is passionate to find out the answers. Whether they individually believe in a certain particle or not is another story, but they all agree that it's worthwhile finding out. So it's really a bottom-up structure. And and when we say that it's not managed, it's not entirely true, but because it does require coordination. It did need a person like myself. Just to be clear, there were 2,999 others. I'm just one of a very small group, and of course today I'm not in Atlas. So just be very clear, I'm not part of the active management now. But when we built the experiment, that's how we worked, and it was really a collective enterprise. Yes, it does require coordination, but it's not like one boss who says, do this. Instead, it's really kind of shaping up. So I think that's the best explanation I can give. I don't know if it helps, but this is how I see it.
So Marcus, yeah, that makes sense. It was a kind of organic, bottom up, in a way, peer to peer. Can you give an example of how that actually happened, and what are some of the mechanisms that you had to kind of invent to make this happen? Because as you know, as I kind of alluded to earlier, there are millions of parts, right, in this machine that you built, and so the level of complexity and interdependence was significant. So you had different people working on different pieces, and sometimes you ended up sort of having to kind of make compromises or adjudicate disputes. So like, how did that happen without everybody going to their boss and saying, make this decision for me?
Okay, a great question. So there are kind of two aspects. There's the, if you like, the technical aspect, and then there's the, let's say, organizational / managerial aspect. So let's quickly go through the technical aspect. So indeed, when we started dreaming about Atlas, this was in the early 1980s. The project got formalized in the early 1990s, and it was completed in 2008. So this gives you an idea of that, we didn't do it over a weekend. It really took decades. Now, on the technical side, it was also clearly understood in the let's say mid 1980s, that the technologies that we needed to find, for example, the Higgs and others, did not exist. So we made an educated bet that even if we start the project, we will be able to find and solve the problems as we encounter them. Now, you're right, Michele, it is a very complex device. It has over 15 million functional components. It's compared to space shuttle that had about 6 million, or the lunar lander that had about 6 million functional components, and a jumbo jet has maybe 3 million, depending whether we count the rivets in that or not. So it is a very complex device, probably as complex as an aircraft carrier in terms of the number of components. So it is clear, given that the technology didn't exist in all parts, in particular the high-end computing part, that we entered into an adventure that wasn't predetermined in all the details. And we were unable, as you correctly pointed out, to ex ante see all the possible things that could go wrong. So the way we got organized, and still are, is that the teams are really, let's say, focusing on specific scientific problems, technological problems. And this is not in like an organizational chart that one is used to seeing companies, where you have these departments, for example. It is much more dynamic. It's driven by the problem. So, for example, if we have a problem in the superconducting magnet, or if we have a problem in the very advanced silicon-based, very fast detectors or sensors, as we call them, then if there's a problem, then we collect the people who we think know most of it. And in many cases, these guys do not actually, they are not part of our community. So we need to reach out to these communities. So there's a certain openness, which I think is one of the topics here today, to realization. I'm quoting kind of Henry Chesbrough, who says you better be clear that the best guys may not be working for you. And this is definitely also the case in our environment, that we do then reach out to universities, technical universities, to help us out. So we go, if you like, crisis by crisis, okay, to be sure that we can fix, and we have the confidence that we can do it, not necessarily alone, but together with competent people. So that's on the technical side. On the administration side, it's somewhat different, and it basically starts by, I mean, the way to describe Atlas and the other experiments is really like it's a picnic party or potluck, if you have a Canadian, vocabulary. And this potluck party, the idea is that everybody gets together. There's a long shopping list. What should we have for a nice picnic party? And then everybody ticks off what they think they can do. And then there's stuff there which is left over, which is then defined as common. So while we do this, then people kind of, or the governments or the countries, they state what they can do, how much money, how many people, and how they can do it. So based on this, it's a kind of a long list of boundary conditions. I don't like that word, but let's use it here. And that sort of sets the way that organizations will be kind of linking to each other. We have what we call a memorandum of understanding. It's a 7-page document, which says clearly on the front page, this is not a legally binding document, describes an effort which is roughly $500 million, choose currency, and then we get on doing it. So it sounds a bit romantic, but that's really how it works.
Well, and it does work. And I just wanted for the audience to share a picture, just to give a sense of the size of this thing, right? There's a person there, I don't know, with a hard hat, in the middle. Marcus, maybe you can tell us what this is.
Okay, so this is the detector before it was ready. So you can actually see the big toroid magnet there. So they have 8 of them. These are superconducting magnets. These are one of the biggest magnets in the world. Not that we want to boast, but it just needs to be to be able to find the Higgs and the others. And indeed, we put a poor guy standing there in the center. Actually, there are about 10 people in that picture. You have to kind of a little bit really look closely to see. And we actually have a 3D version of this, which is pretty cool. Anyway, so these detectors, these sensors, they are then slot in. You see the first one there at the far end. It's called tile calorimeter. And this picture was probably taken, I'd say, early 2007. The size of the device, so that you have a feeling, it's about 46 meters long and 23 meters wide. It weighs 7,000 tons, which is roughly the weight of the Eiffel Tower. It will barely fit in the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris.
And this is all underground, right? You
Yeah.
have to bring the pieces. Is it 100 meters underground?
Yeah, 100 meters underground. And what is really important is that we only had one chance to get the sequence right. There's about 1,200 steps how to put that together. And if we would screw up any of those steps, we would not be able to open it up again.
Yeah, wow. That's amazing. So again, incredible discipline, precision, without any of the orthodoxy when it comes to management. And I love what you mentioned earlier, Marcus, about the fact that it was like ad hoc. I mean, it's almost, Ari Mintzberg talks about ad hocracy, where you have like these temporary task forces that come together. It sounds like you relied heavily on those. And then this kind of minimal viable governance is, mechanism that said, let's just specify, as you say, the boundary conditions, and then everything else we'll just have to figure out as we go along, and resist the urge of specifying everything in advance.
Yeah, correct.
Right?
So by the way, just to jump in, if you like Henry's stuff, I mean, it's a bit old now, but we will be a mix of adhocracy and mission-driven organization.
Right. Yeah. Maybe we can come back to that, because I know you invested quite a bit, and there's a lot you did deliberately to create that. Well, everybody came with, a sense of purpose and mission, but then there was a lot you did to foster that sense of community that, greases the wheels. So maybe we can come back to that. The other thing, by the way, since Julia talked about openness earlier, you had a very open approach to information sharing. So the different parts of the detector working on different things were, very transparent about where they were, so everybody could have the same picture. It's not that all the information was fed to the higher ups and they're the only ones who could see what was going on.
Correct.
All right. Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, we'll come back to you for sure. And let's go to Tom, our third panelist, who, also works in an industry where, discipline and precision is important. Financial services, highly regulated, right? Prudence and risk are, Tom, are sacrosanct, or at least they should be, right? And they're not always. And when you talk to people about the VZ model, which I'm sure you'll unpack a little bit, but just to give people some highlights, you have no real management layers, you don't really have annual performance reviews, you don't really have a budgeting process. Their heads must explode, right? It's like, so could you maybe unpack a little bit the VZ model, Tom, and tease out how you're able to get kind of this both and, when it comes to, to freedom and control, to risk and risk management and prudence and initiative and self-management on the other side.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me in this illustrious panel. I hope it's not seen as too simple what I'm going to tell you. But let's say the starting point would be that, let's say in general, and I'm not talking about, let's say, building airplanes, but in general, we seem to make things very complicated. And we add all the time a lot of stuff, although we think that it should be the opposite. So it's in the end much easier to make things much more complicated all the time if you think about management, and it's more difficult to keep things simple. Why? Because adding is just very natural. So that's one starting point, and the other starting point is to think more in kind of intellectual models about biases or counterintuitive thinking, etc. And it's about narratives. And what we don't realize very often is that we are, let's say, we have kind of fixed narratives, can be, for instance, linear thinking as an example. And then at certain times we find out that we locked ourselves up in kind of narrative. So I was just reading the excellent book of David Graeber, The Dawn of Everything. And then you see of a prehistorian research that there are very big complex cities or other very difficult structures which had a very self-organizing idea of organizing, for instance, those cities. So this idea of there is a kind of linear thinking that in the beginning something was very simple and primitive, and then we had to go through enlightenment and linear thinking to structure this in a very vertical hierarchical way, is just from a research or scientific point of view just not the case. So these are this kind of intellectual starting points, and for sake of the discussion and also for people who want to, let's say, join the audience with their questions, I took just one slide out of a lot of presentations, which thank you, Michelle, you're just putting on the screen now, and we try to put it in very practical stuff, although for every practical point there's an enormous amount of scientific research behind it. So for those people who would like to dive into let's say our model, just to take a few, let's say, this whole idea of no bosses, but I call it primus inter pares, rotation of leadership, is a very old Republican principle. We didn't invent this. So I would say all those principles that are here, this is seen as something which is very innovative, but I would say it's not innovative, it's just changing the narratives. Or if you talk about, let's say, trust or autonomy, decentralized decision making is also a very old example. Marcus Nordberg just showed a much more complicated example than our, let's say, small company. Or if you talk about peer-to-peer feedback, which is much stronger than performance reviews, or decentralized hiring, or the golden rule, we never invented it. It's in all religions that you should act in a way you also would like to be treated. Or if you take, for instance, beyond budgeting, which became popular again by Handelsbanken, but also was not invented by them. Or if you talk about radical transparency, which is an example which is from the parliamentary tradition of something which works much better if something transparent, if you compare this with a lot of secrecy. So I would say we just took a lot of examples, and this was not the starting point. We just tried stuff and then just kept what worked. And the whole idea was also, if we want to build a real huge company, we should always ask ourselves, does this work when the company is 100 or 1,000 times bigger? And that gives us a way of thinking that we shouldn't just only think about, does it work at the moment, but would it also work, let's say, when we are much bigger than we are now?
That's awesome. The very, very helpful explanation, Tom. I mean, I love the fact that, I mean, in a way, you went back to some of the deeper truths, like almost pre-modern truths of about what human beings and how they interact with each other, and mining the long history, right, of problem solving and governance, and saying, what can we learn from that, as opposed to just starting with what passes by conventional wisdom, and also this notion of iterating and going as kind of changing things, tweaking things as you go, and thinking about change, especially adjusting as you become bigger. Can you maybe speak to what, this maybe one particular tension or conflict that, that you really need to manage very carefully, and that you need to really have to think hard about how to resolve it without, going back to the old way of managing? Is there one thing that stands out?
Yeah, what is a very practical problem is that if you, let's say, for instance, have a rotation system, you really have to define from a strategy point of view that rotation is more important than experience, for example, if you are long-term oriented. But it's also a very Republican principle. So if you take the example of the presidency in the United States, you can only be a president for two times, and then because you want to focus on the long-term survival of your democracy, so to say. So, but that's sometimes difficult, because if there's somebody who's doing a really good job, everybody says, Michel, you're so experienced, you did such a good job, could you just continue? And then we have to reflect on that and say, yes, Michel did a wonderful job, and he may be much more experienced than we are, but for the long-term focus and the long-term strategy of the system, it makes sense to rotate. And then Michel can, let's say, support as a coach the person who is less experienced. And then often then afterwards, people find out that it works much better than expected.
So you have to, in a way, resist the allure of like a short-term fix, and think very, very much about the long-term viability of the institution, saying, well, yeah, maybe this will help us in the next 3 months, but it'll undermine, it's like George, you mentioned, the early years of the American Republic. I mean, George Washington, he could have stayed on as president for a third term. He decided not to, and because he, so it's that kind of, so it requires a little bit of self-sacrifice on the part of those in power, as well as a longer time, kind of view, right, of what's important. There are a lot of questions, Tom, related to compensation when it comes to your to Visa and how it works. Can you, and also the golden rule. I don't know if you can kind of unpack those and provide some more details on those particular, how those principles or practical rules, get instantiated in practice.
Yeah, compensation. There are always a lot of questions, because our narrative is so fixed that we even don't realize that we are in this kind of mental box. So let's say the narrative of salaries nowadays is output oriented. So then we try to measure this, and there's a lot of research done on this, which just shows that there is no correlation between, let's say, output and salaries. So the narrative would be, let's say, to zoom out and say, okay, if we create a good environment, let's call it psychological safety, between brackets Amy Edmondson, and if we have peer-to-peer feedback and people are working together in a team, would a bonus culture not be counterproductive?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of research done on this. So everybody understands that if a team wants to work together, and that the team output is makes much more sense. This whole Google Aristotle project. Why would you then install individual bonuses? And the financial sector is a very good example of the effect of individual bonuses. We won't dive into that topic. So I would say the starting point is always to have this kind of intellectual debate, then dive into the research. Most of the times you find enough stuff which really explains that, for instance, in this case, individual bonuses are counterproductive. And then the question would still be, why does this continue? And there are other reasons for that. But science has a very clear answer to that. But that's a general topic. And what's also interesting is that if people work together, and it doesn't matter if it's in a working environment, there's an enormous acceptance, even towards differences in output or performances, as long as everybody is really willing to do, let's say, their best to contribute to the best team output, which is also in families or societies, but you just share the work in a different way. So it's all about narratives.
Yeah.
And the second one you wanted to know was the golden rule?
Yeah, I don't know if there's an example of how that gets put into practice.
Yeah,
fairly quickly.
Yeah, it's a very practical, simple example I often mention is that we had a colleague and her father was very sick. And her father, I mean, we are based in the Netherlands. Her father was in Spain, and she went there, and everybody understood that she had to go there because we didn't know how long her father would live, and it took much longer, and there was a lot of work to do, and people said in this team, when will she come back? Because we have such amount of work, and then it's always the duty of people who are in charge or more experienced to say, frame it in a way, Michelle, when your father would be in Spain, what would you hope your colleagues would tell you?
Yeah.
And then in this practical questions, we ask people to think about this. So if people say, oh, sorry, she has to come back, then we say, okay, think about it. And tell me next day or 2 days after how did you reflect on that? And in most cases, you always have the answer, sorry, I have to apologize for being too fast and thinking too much about myself, because everybody wants to be supported by their colleagues if you would be in such a situation. And that works perfectly well.
Right. Well, a very, very good example. Well, I actually have a question for all of you, all three of you. Thanks, by the way, for your the way you talked and unpacked your various perspectives. I mean, it's fascinating. They're quite different in many respects, but there are some really interesting commonalities. And so one of the things I picked up on, I think certainly in the case of Marcus and Tom, perhaps even Julia, this is relevant for open strategy, open innovation, but it's this notion that you need to have these trust-based relationships and this. And those often are built over time, and you can't necessarily compress time to build trust and relationships that have a long-term view. So at CERN and Atlas, Marcus, you had colleagues working for 15 years, right, to kind of plan and then build the detector, and then even longer for operating it. I'm sure there's turnover and people moving around, but the community has some permanence. And Tom, when it comes to VC, I don't know what the turnover there is. I'm assuming it's much lower than it is in a typical organization, right? The people are there maybe for longer, right? So, and Julia, when it comes to trusting people with opening up the strategy, maybe that's something you do when you know that the people who are giving you input inside the company are going to be there for a long time and they're vested in the future of the company. They're not just there for 3 months. So, I guess very long premise to the question of, is it important to manage some of these trade-offs and in ways that don't rely so much on top-down management, to have permanence, to have a less attrition, to have a ties that are built over long periods of time? Is that a precondition, or maybe not? I don't know who wants to tackle that first.
I mean, maybe I can start, because I think in the case of open strategy, it might not necessarily be so much a precondition, but rather an outcome that you say, how can I achieve that we can build these relationships and people are really engaged and feeling that they are working on a purpose? How can I do that? And I would say I would definitely not be able to create such a situation if they are confronted with top-down management and not being involved. So I think maybe it's even a cycle by engaging them, by giving employees the opportunity to be part of the conversation and discussion, giving them a way to be part of the entire story. We have seen, based on data, that this increases substantially their sense of belongingness to the organization, and this helps to set up those relationships that allow me to create this trust that is then necessary to have those situations that have just been described in the other presentations. So I would say it's a circle, but I would even say it starts out by giving them the opportunity to be involved and show their voice before you have those long-lasting relationships.
I think it's I wanted to say something about, let's say, especially society as a whole. So I mean, I'm a historian, and let's say behavior is also follows a kind of institutional structure you build. So if you have a certain setup, and people start adapt to a kind of institution, which I always find very interesting. So you have those examples of the Toyota factories, and everybody thought it only would work in Japan, until the Japanese started to build factories in the US, and they thought, oh, it also works here. So the institutional frameworks plays an enormous role. Or if you feel safe in a country, you don't close your door. But it depends on where you live. And if you live in an unsafe place, you close your door. And then everybody is adapting to this, and then people start to support each other or asking their questions. They ask them, if you're new, is this really the case? This can be too good to be true in this environment. Is it really okay to be away until, let's say, everything at home is fine again? And then people say, yes, it is, because in the past I acted in the same way, and that's our culture. So I think it takes time, and then it is a kind of self-reinforcing effect in the whole system.
Marcus, I don't know if you wanted to opine on whether you need like like a long-term perspective and a stable community for the magic that you experienced and you developed at Atlas to really take hold.
Yeah, I think
could you imagine doing that in a more transient kind of organization?
No, we couldn't. This is clear. Trust in our business is everything. As I mentioned, the time frames are long. The institutional setting, which is defined by this, what we call memorandum of understanding, by the way, not only for Atlas, but of course for the other CERN experiments, that requires, that is not a legally binding document. It is not a contractual document. It's not like a supplier-buyer type of neoclassical contract. It is an intent of best effort. And when we are talking about relatively large sums of money for Atlas, at least $500 million, trust is essential. And this is quote unquote institutionalized through the universities and research labs that we work with. So yes, you are right, there is a lot of turnover in terms of people, but the agreements between and across the participating 200 institutions you were quoting, Michele, this is the lifeline, and it requires fundamental trust.
Right. Yeah. But I also love Julia's point that, well, maybe you can't start to build trust by opening up. So it's a two-way street. And as Tom said, the institutional design can either work to foster trust or undermine it. And so you do have choices, not that you have to throw up your hands in the air if you don't have, a 15-year time horizon to look forward to, which I guess brings me, I don't know, maybe to the last question for all of you, which is, you've all described very particular, some might say idiosyncratic approaches to managing, leading, and organizing. And so, which are great, they're very provocative. But, people might say, well, it's the exception that kind of proves the rule. So like there's, CERN, they do it this way. It's really neat and interesting. It can be done, but my organization is nothing like CERN or Atlas, so what's it, and same thing, when it comes to open strategy or the VZ experience, Tom. So what would you say to people that are actually open-minded and want to learn and want to maybe take away something practical from your experience? What would you say to them? Like, what are some of the practical lessons, maybe one from each of you, from your experience that you think is generalizable or can be kind of exported to a more traditional kind of organizational setting?
I would say that it's not the exception, actually, but that's also our narrative. So we think that the world is about big multinational corporations or stock listed. but our society is not only about companies. So if you talk about, let's say, all these examples, and if you think about how you organize your private lives, or how you deal with your friendships, or how do we deal with our neighbors and societies, and change our narrative, I think these are the basic rules of living together. And there are some exceptions, which are called big multinational corporations, who are short-term oriented and they are stock listed. That's my takeaway.
All right. So yeah. So think more broadly. Expand your horizons. There are alternatives. It's not, it's like economists looking for a key under the light post, right? The lamp post. So maybe you should just look more broadly. Okay. Cool. Thank you, Tom. Julia, Marcus, do you have any thoughts?
So we are often asked whether this model would work in the industry or in the private sector. And my answer is always, I have no freaking idea. But what I can tell you is that if you are purpose-driven, you are working in a very complex environment, and that you are operating with long time frames, a bottom-up approach might not be a bad idea.
Yeah, and you could argue, Marcus, that yes, maybe companies are not facing the same complexity and technical challenge you had to, but more and more, in a creative economy, in a knowledge economy, the problems will approximate, the ones you had to deal with. And so, maybe try to learn. And again, check out Marcus's book, where he goes into a little bit more detail on the specifics that you can kind of be inspired by. So, Julia, you can have the last word on this one.
Yeah, just very briefly, what we see in the cases of open strategy, it really only works if the people are really open-minded. So I think it really starts at an individual level and at the level of everybody who is engaged in an organization. Are you really comfortable with approaching others, asking others in a case of a problem, being comfortable with serendipity, with unpredictable outcomes? And I think this is something that still executives today have to learn a little bit, and have to be comfortable, and have to overcome the notion that strategy is their role and their responsibility. And I think if we have this movement also at an individual level in an organizational setting, because Tom has said we have this movement already in our other parts of our society, I think then it would be really working on a broader level. But it starts at the individual level.
Yeah. Very good. Well, maybe just a quick follow-up on that, because Tom has also mentioned institutional design. Are there specific things that make it difficult for organizations to be open and take an open strategy approach? So, for instance, insider trading rules, right? And the fact that if you give employees a certain kinds of information about financial performance, they need to be, the SEC needs, in the United States, the stock the Securities and Exchange Commission needs to be told, like, these are, everybody in the company is an insider. And so then it creates all sorts of constraints. So are there things that are making it difficult institutionally for companies to open up? I mean, aside from like individual kind of biases and all of that.
I mean, there might be some, and that's always because regulations are always slow to follow movements and things that are happening there. I think there are ways to overcome them. And as I've said, it's not chaos. You can control it. You can set it up in a very careful way to be able to do that in a very controllable way. But of course, there might be conditions that require you to be careful with some aspects. But I think they can be overcome.
Yeah, you have no excuse. Like if you
exactly
get going, there's a lot you can do. Yeah,
exactly.
Which is, I think, a great message to close off with, the fact that yes, these are very inspiring examples. They may be quite different from where your organization reality you live in, but there are ways to learn from them and to take steps. And as Julia said, maybe start with you and whatever is part of your perimeter, and then kind of build from there. So that's good. So we there is hope, and I hope you've also gotten that through this discussion. And on behalf of the forum, of the Ren Dan Hoi Open Talk 22 forum, I wanted to thank Julia, Tom, and Marcus one more time. And I look forward to seeing all of you in the sessions that are scheduled for later today. Thank you so much and see you soon.